All right, so welcome everyone. Welcome to the 5th annual Implementation Science Reading course here at Northwestern. For the first time, this course is being co-sponsored by the brand new Center for Dissemination and Implementation Science, which I have the pleasure of directing, and is also co-sponsored by the NewCats Dissemination and Implementation Science program. Today's session will be covered by myself and Dr. Dennis Lee, who's based at the Institute for Sexual and Gender Minority Health and Wellbeing. And we will be covering the topic, Shifting Your Focus, an Introduction to Dissemination and Implementation Science. So let's move on to the next slide. And we have very ambitious goals for our first session together today. So let me give you a little bit of a roadmap of what we hope to cover. First, we're going to start off with a public display of gratitude and share a little bit about the history of this course and thank some of the key folks that have brought this to you at Northwestern, as well as the folks that will be helping to lead you through this experience this year. Then we're going to spend some time orienting you to the course logistics and structure each week, a little bit of a what to expect every time you come and join us for this course. Then we'll spend a good chunk of our time introducing you to the topic of shifting your focus and introducing you to some of the fundamentals of dissemination and implementation science. We will then very briefly point you to some resources throughout the Northwestern community. Those first 4 buckets we hope to cover in our first about 30 minutes or so together. And then we will divide you into small discussion groups for the remainder of our time, during which we will talk about the assigned readings that we asked you to read in anticipation of week 1. So moving on, let's talk about who we have to thank. So this course was really pioneered by Hendrix Brown and his team, and led by leaders such as Dennis Lee, Miriam Rafferty, Allison Carroll, and Ashley Knapp. And so we really just want to thank them for being the impetus for creating this course 5 years ago. It really came out of an acute need within the Northwestern community. People were hungry for expertise in dissemination and implementation science. We're hearing about this exciting area of research, but there weren't a lot of resources and training and educational opportunities. So this group really came together to create this to meet the acute need within the community. This year, we're joined by a number of new staff and faculty at the new Center for Dissemination and Implementation Science, which was formed in August of 2022. We also have some wonderful leaders and researchers in implementation science that will be joining us throughout the course as guest lecturers that are also pictured here on your slides, and we want to publicly thank all of them. Moving on to the next slide, we also have a number of key staff that we need to, oh, I'm so sorry. There was some purple slides there. I want to just pause for a moment and thank Dr. Sarah Helseth and Miranda Olson. Dr. Sarah Helseth is new faculty at the Center for Dissemination and Implementation Science, and Miranda Olson is a new research project manager. They're both going to be discussion group leads and have really been integral in doing all of the behind the scenes coordination. As you see, this is a full slide of faces. It takes a lot of effort to keep all of those faces moving in the right direction, to be staying on deadlines, to make sure everything we're doing feels cohesive for you so that it's one cohesive course led by a number of experts. So really want to thank Dr. Helseth and Miranda for their work helping in that regard. We also want to thank a number of key staff and some of our co-sponsors. A course like this could not be done without administrative and logistical support. And so this year, we're very grateful for funding from the NewCats Dissemination and Implementation Science program, as well as the Center for Dissemination and Implementation Science for helping to fund some administrative staff for this course. I also, again, want to publicly thank the Bridges program and the Prevention Science Methodology Group, which this year is also co-branded and funded by the Center for Dissemination and Implementation at Stanford, for giving us a lot of the administrative scaffolding. In prior years, Nanette Hanna and Juan Villamar were truly integral for getting this course off the ground, so we want to thank them and their historical knowledge. And we also want to thank this year Emma Little. If your experience goes well today, please thank Emma. Emma is doing so much of the heavy lifting behind the scenes, assigning us all to breakouts, doing all of the calendaring, testing the Zoom. This simply could not happen without Emma. So just really want to thank her for her coordination and administrative leadership. And then finally, we want to publicly acknowledge all of us Northwestern faculty and staff are coming to you sitting on traditional homelands of people of the Council of Three Fires. And we want to acknowledge that this was a site of historical and cultural significance, and we're very grateful to be able to be here and we acknowledge this land that we are upon. All right, so moving on, this course was really carefully curated based on a wonderful article by Padek and colleagues. If you look there on your screen, that's a hyperlink. You will get these slides, and there's a hyperlink to a wonderful resource by Padek and colleagues, which lists 43 implementation science competencies that they recommend researchers have across beginner, intermediate, and advanced areas. Each week, we will help you to reach a specific set of competencies. And this week, we are covering the beginner competencies in what they deem the definition, background, and rationale of implementation science. In brief, we're going to help you know what implementation science is. We're going to help you know what it is not. We're going to help you to differentiate between implementation science research and other areas. We're going to help you to understand the potential impact of this work. And we're going to try to convince you that you need a range of expertise to do this work well. All right. So our logistics with the readings, we're going to ask you every time that you come to a session to please read the articles linked on your syllabus. There will be 2 to 3 classic widely cited articles that will be required, because these are the articles that you should be citing if you do grants or manuscripts in this area. And they are the classic ones that really much of the field is based upon. We'll also recommend some concept and action articles that show you what these principles look like when they are applied. And we might recommend some textbooks and additional readings that are fully optional just to further flesh out these ideas. We will also, each time we meet, start with a didactic presentation. These will be co-led by Northwestern faculty, and that's because we want you to learn to know and meet your colleagues so that you can build your own network if you do decide to do work in this area. Our didactics most weeks will be only 20 to 30 minutes. Because this week we are orienting you to this area, we will likely go more like 30 to 35 minutes in our didactics, but we will focus on teaching you practical frameworks, measures, and methods each week. And we want to assure you that a copy of slides and recordings will be saved within 1 week, and that should actually read SharePoint. We're going to be using SharePoint this year to store all of your slides. All right, and then we will spend the remainder of our time in group discussion with groups of about 10 in size. We have carefully assigned you to these based on the experience levels you noted when you registered for this course, as well as some of your interests. Those discussions will focus on the week's readings as well as applied examples. And just as a friendly call, we will ask you to please not use that time for methods consultations if you need a specific methods consultation for your work. But if you do, we are happy to connect you with resources throughout the community where you can get a one-on-one methods consultation if you might need one. Okay. So we're going to ask each of you to sign up to be a peer discussant one time over the next 9 sessions. Your role as peer discussant will be to pose 2 to 3 discussion questions to your group. And you can raise any points of the readings that inspired you, confused you, or interested you. You will be paired with a faculty lead. But we do this because we really want people to be engaged in the course and to feel a sense of co-ownership of your discussion group. So we really hope that as part of our meeting today, in that second part of our time together, when you're in your small group, that you will actually sign up to be peer discussant at some point between week 2 and week 10. Our next slide is a call for action that we are asking you to pretty please try to adhere to our group expectations. We ask that you commit to attending at least 8 of the 10 weeks that we have scheduled. We ask that you please come to every session having read the readings and ready to talk about them. We ask that you sign up to be a peer discussant at least once, and we ask that you please kindly keep your camera on. We want this to feel like it's an in-person experience, so especially during the latter part where we are in small groups, please do keep your camera on if you can, and please don't widely share this syllabus. The syllabus took a lot of work, and we really believe is a special thing that we've created. If you would like to share it, please just ask us. We tend to be very generous, but it really helps us to track the impact of this program if we know when it is being shared more widely. If you can't do this, please let us know. We do have a wait list for this class, so we would encourage you to consider attending again in the future if this year is not the right fit for you. Okay, I think we are now ready to talk about implementation science. What is it exactly, and why is it useful? We're going to spend our next 15 minutes or so really diving into what this field of science is. And we're going to start by introducing you to our D&I Science Bridge. Because in lay language, dissemination and implementation science is bridging the gap between what we know in terms of public health knowledge and what we actually do in terms of public health practice. And one of the things we've been really intentional in arguing about here at our new Center for Dissemination and Implementation Science is that it isn't really just one gap. It's multiple gaps that we have to bridge at once, and that we have to do this with intention and with a relentless focus on equity. So now we're going to go through each of these elements in turn. But first, I'm going to give you a slide that just tells you exactly what the D is and what the I is so that you have this as a resource. And when we say dissemination research, that's basically research to increase the demand for health services in the community. It's usually the distribution of information and materials to a broad audience. Implementation research, on the other hand, is research to increase the supply of treatment out in the community. And it tends to be the study of the use of strategies to adopt or integrate evidence-based interventions into a specific setting. We are in this course going to spend much more time on implementation research than on dissemination research, but we thought it was helpful for you to know what both of these areas are. Now let's talk about each of the gaps. And first, why? Why do we need this field of science? I don't think we need to convince you since you're all here, but basically because our health system is incredibly fragmented. This is a picture of the Grand Canyon, which I use as my visual metaphor of the healthcare system anytime I give a talk, because the healthcare system has multiple gaps. It's not one singular thing. It's multiple gaps that are adjacent and interact to form an enormous chasm. And let's talk about each of these gaps in turn. The first gap is the gap that between the care that is available in the community and the care that could be available, otherwise known as our public health supply gap. If I needed to convince you that this was a problem, there are two beautiful reports from the Institute of Medicine that really document this concern. They're called Crossing the Quality Chasm. And I love that title because it's not, the word gap just doesn't feel sufficient to capture the enormity of the difference between what we know about what should be our standard of care and what actually is the standard of care. There's a really strong statistic in the field of implementation science that it takes 17 years to turn 14% of original research to the benefit of patients. When people hear that, they're like, that can't be. So we actually have a visual here that just shows our research pipeline and why it takes so long. It's a very leaky journey from when we actually see a signal in our studies to when we're able to publish it, to when it gets integrated into guidelines for evidence-based care and until it actually gets out into practice. Let's talk about our second gap now, which is the gap between the care that is needed and the care that's received. This is our public health demand gap, and addressing this gap usually requires dissemination science as opposed to implementation science strategies. What you're seeing here is just a visual of the % of Americans with a specific diagnosis that receive any healthcare service at all. And so I just wanted to note the proportion of people with a substance use disorder that receive any care is only 20%. Those with a mental health disorder, less than 50%. Those with HIV, only about 2/3 will get effective care, and those with disability, only about 70%. So just to note, there are enormous gaps between those that need care and those that receive any at all. And the level of unmet need tends to be greatest among those with lower education, lower socioeconomic status, and those from racial and ethnic minority groups. There are two other gaps that are really important for us to address as well, and that is what we call our expertise capacity gap and our scientific gap. In a brief word, this is basically the gap between the talent that we need and the methods that we need and what we actually have in our arsenal. And the point I want to make here is that implementation research is still really rare, as are implementation researchers. So part of our goal here is to actually build the capacity for implementation science at Northwestern. The visual on your screen is one example from one funding institute, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, just documenting how one of their landmark initiatives was to address opioids and stimulants over the last decade, and only 1.5% of all funded studies were implementation research. This is true, very similar patterns if you look across funding institutes. So again, just to make the call that this field is wide open, we have a major gap between the level of enthusiasm for this area of science and the actual talent that is available, and we hope that this course can help to address that. So specifically, we will be teaching you strategies to address the public health supply gap. We will be trying to address the expertise capacity gap, and we will be teaching you methods to address the scientific gap. We will do less of dissemination science in this course, although we will preview it a bit in week 9 and 10. So one final slide before I turn it over to my very talented colleague, Dennis, is how do we start to build this implementation science bridge? How do we actually start to address these gaps? Well, first, let's think about the status quo. The status quo is that we usually think about our interventions or our health services, and we look at their effects on patient outcomes. So we think about the extent to which our interventions or health services help symptoms, function, and satisfaction. What that does is ignore a whole lot of things in between. For instance, it ignores the strategies that we might use to get that intervention into practice. So like, how are we actually getting the frontline workforce to deliver that intervention? It also ignores a number of important outcomes, such as, is this feasible for people in a healthcare system? Can they deliver it with fidelity? Is it acceptable to them? What does it cost for them to deliver it? It also ignores a host of services outcomes, such as, is it efficient for people? Is it delivered with equity? Is it patient-centered? Is it timely? It also ignores a whole bunch of contextual issues all around in terms of, what is the environment like where it's delivered? What are the people like who are delivering it? And as that beautiful graphic just showed, all those factors are really the core of implementation research. So thinking about the strategies, the outcomes, the context, all those things that we don't consider when we do the status quo, that's really the heart of implementation science. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Dennis, who's going to really help to walk us through some of this in more detail.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Hi, everyone. Dennis Lee here. I use he, him pronouns. So at this point, we want to acknowledge that some of you might be starting to feel like this. Implementation science trainings are notorious for throwing a lot of concepts at you very quickly and a lot of terminology as well over a very short period of time. And the Bauer reading from today alluded to those complexities that come from focusing on multi-level systems of change. So the course planning team, as Sarah alluded to, was very careful in curating articles that were both seminal but also easy to understand. And we really want to come with this course from a pragmatic lens. So throughout the course, we'll do our best to eliminate the jargon while still ensuring that you can still talk the talk with other implementation scientists. So that said, the field of implementation science can be overwhelming and confusing, even for implementation scientists. So it's really helpful to have some non-jargony heuristics to turn back to. And these are things that that implementation scientists go back to all the time. So all of implementation research is centered around an intervention, a practice, or an innovation that improves people's health. And typically, we just go ahead and call that the thing. That is the thing that has evidence behind it. Now, regular implementation is going to be people out there doing the thing. And effectiveness research, which precedes implementation research, looks at whether the thing works at improving people's health or not. Whereas implementation research, on the other hand, looks at how to help other people out there do the thing. We'll be touching on these other components as we move along, as well as we move along the course. But implementation determinants, or the context that Sarah was talking about, these are conditions that make it harder or easier for other people to do the thing. Oftentimes we call them barriers and facilitators, but the key word here is conditions, because these tend to be states or traits of contexts of peoples that are barriers or facilitators. Now we have implementation strategies. These are the actions that we take as change agents to help other people do the thing. And the key word here is actions. Oftentimes either verbs or something has to be doing or moving along. And finally, our implementation and service outcomes. These measure how much or how well other people are doing the thing. So implementation research really requires a shift in focus. And for many people, the transition from efficacy or effectiveness research that you might be trained in to implementation research is quite a paradigm shift. I think of intervention research, which is efficacy and effectiveness research, is a bit like portrait mode on your camera. You're really hyper-focused on testing the thing that is in front of you. And then the delivery system that supports that intervention is kind of in the background, blurred out. It's there, but you don't really measure it. It's controlled for. But typically it's not the focus of what you're looking at. Now, on the other hand, pure implementation research is like the opposite. It's the landscape mode in your phone, if you have it. The thing is the blurry part in the front, and really your attention is turning to all of the rich stuff that's happening in the background. Now, table 3 from the Bauer reading really operationalizes this well. The shift in focus from intervention to delivery system in really great detail. And so for those of you who didn't get a chance to read this paper yet, it's a very nice and very easy to read breakdown of all the differences between efficacy, effectiveness, and implementation trials in particular. So they talk about, I won't go through the whole table in detail, but they talk about kind of what the hypotheses, the main hypotheses of these three types of design principles are. They talk about how narrow the inclusion criteria for the population of your study needs to be for each of these trial designs. They talk about the types of outcomes that you are wanting to look at. So efficacy and effectiveness research, of course, is still focused a lot on the thing itself, whereas implementation research really is about people or other people doing the thing. It talks about kind of the limitations of who is actually delivering the intervention at each of these stages. You move from highly controlled research staff all the way to kind of the real world clinicians already at their clinic or community-based organization where they sit. And the context also changes from highly controlled, really ideal situations through the real world where there's a lot of messiness, a lot of variables to not so much control because you can't control them, but to keep in mind and measure. I'll let you ponder that some more in the slides and in the reading, and we'll move on to kind of a next article that we had you all read today. So the Lane Fall reading pragmatically operationalizes how one decides to shift that focus over time. It really highlights two questions at the junctions on this subway map. So when you have a practice of interest, as they call it, a thing in our terms today, you ask the questions at the most basic level, do you have efficacy? Do you have efficacy data on the thing? And if you do not, then you're squarely in the efficacy research territory. If you do, then you can ask the question of, do you have effectiveness data? Has this been shown to be, has the thing been shown to work in more real world settings, still highly controlled, but more real world settings? If you don't, then you're squarely in effectiveness research land. If you do, then you're on your way to implementation research. And if you're kind of in that middle ground, you have some effectiveness data, you're interested in implementation, or maybe you're doing a lot of adaptations, you might be in that middle hybrid effectiveness implementation trial lane that we will talk about at a later date. What I also like about this paper is that it really highlights down here in the bottom green section, the three pieces of implementation research. Whereas the Bauer reading really focused exclusively on trials, this one kind of lays out the early stage implementation research that really needs to happen. So you first have to understand the context. You have to design strategies that meet those contexts and targets barriers and facilitators before you can even get to testing in a trial. So I really like how they set that up. Now, the third reading we had you look through today, or read through today, was by Nilsson and talks about three major functions of frameworks, models, theories, and frameworks, oh my, to describe all of the different things that are happening in implementation research. At a high level summary, we have models that describe the process or like what you're doing along the way of implementing. Then we have this middle kind of group that has subdivides. These are frameworks and theories that talk about what influences the process. And we'll mostly be focusing on the determinant frameworks here. And then finally, this latter group that focuses on evaluating or what you should be looking at to determine implementation success. So I'll give you very briefly a quick example of the most common frameworks from each of these things. Some of you may have heard of this before. It's called the EPIS model, and this is one of the most popular process models out there. It really talks about how implementation has 4 phases to it. You start in exploration, trying to understand, what are the needs in your community or what are the needs for a particular thing. You get into preparation when you've made a commitment, you're going to do the thing, but you need to set it up and figure out what your strategies are. Then you move to actual implementation, and then over time you sustain it. A very, very popular determinant model is the CFIR, or the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research. And we'll talk about this in a second, but it is very confusing that some models have framework in their title and other frameworks have models in their title. So we're going to ignore that for now. It's called the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, but it is a determinant model. And what it is it's a very long list of almost all the possible things, all of the possible characteristics in a multi-level setting that can influence your implementation. So things, the thing itself has characteristics that might influence implementation. The people using the thing have characteristics like their knowledge, their self-efficacy that influences implementation. Those people particularly deliverers, they exist in a context that has policies, that has rooms, it has patient workflows that influence the positively or negatively influences delivery of the thing. And of course, there's the outer setting kind of macro level things, macro level factors like payment, insurance, things that are outside the clinic level or your community setting that will, of course, implement or influence your implementation. Finally, a very popular evaluation framework. We've already seen this in kind of the diagram that Sarah presented earlier. This is the Proctor Implementation Outcomes Model, where they present these 7 implementation outcomes, but also tie them to the service outcomes and the client outcomes down below. We'll come back to all of these in a second. So again, models, theories, and frameworks, oh my, in our field, there are over 100 of these MTFs out there, guiding people to do implementation in various different ways. And it's also where people who are new to implementation science get the most hung up. What's the difference between this model or that framework? There are hundreds of models, which is the right one to use? So here are a few points of advice that we like to tell folks who are entering this field for the first time. One, and unlike a lot of effectiveness or efficacy or effectiveness studies, a typical implementation research study is going to use multiple model theories or frameworks, each one having a different purpose. You might want something to guide your process, you want something to guide your evaluation, and you potentially want something to guide your determinants if you're measuring context as well. For everyday implementation research, what all of you need to do your jobs here as you move into implementation research in your research careers, the differentiation between what a model is, a theory is, and a framework is very negligible. So for our purposes, they're just going to be MTFs, and we'll treat them kind of the same. I love this quote by, I think it's George E. Box. All models are wrong, but some are useful. And among the hundreds of theories, models, and frameworks out there, kind of is set in these different categories, it really doesn't matter which determinant framework you're picking, or it really doesn't matter which process framework you're picking, as long as you select it based on your specific context, your need, your utility, and you're using it in the right way. So the only incorrect model theory or framework out there is one that you've misapplied. Don't use an evaluation framework to study determinants, vice versa. So pulling it all together, there's all of these theories, models, and frameworks out there, and it's really hard to keep track of all the moving parts. So the final substantive slide for today is a preview of a tool that we're going to help you learn about along the way throughout this course. So we have all of these theories, models, and frameworks out there, and then throw in the how and the what, the thing and the strategies that we're using. And we put this all together nicely in one logic model called the Implementation Research Logic Model. All the boxes fit in there perfectly. They all relate to each other. We will spend a lot of time talking about this over the next 6 or so weeks. But it's just a nice preview for where we're going. And I'm going to turn it back over to Sarah to talk about some quick announcements before we move into breakouts.
Great. That was absolutely excellent, Dennis. Thank you so much. And if you're listening and thinking like, oh, I'd love to learn more about CFR, or I want to learn more about this, please know you will. So each element of the implementation research logic he mentioned will be a week of this course. So you'll take a deep dive into contextual determinants. We'll take a deep dive into strategies, a deep dive into outcomes. So each of these will be topics that we will have much more time to ingest and talk about together. A couple things we wanted to do just before going into breakouts was just put some plugs in for some of our colleagues and services across campus. So I just wanted to note, when we share these slides with you, we will have hyperlinks to a number of pilot grant opportunities that are available within the Northwestern community. So if you get excited by this course and think, I'd really like to just stick my toe into these waters and try a small implementation science study, there are a number of pilot award programs that are available. The New CATS Pilot Awards program was just revamped to make dissemination and implementation science a major focus. It used to be a separate call for proposals. Now it's infused in their translational science initiative and is a major area of priority. So that is an option that is available to you. Those grants are up to $30,000. The New CATS has a KL2 program that supports faculty. The LOI was just due February 1, but maybe they would look the other way and consider LOIs over the next week or so if anyone's super enthusiastic, but those full proposals are due March 1. So if you submitted an LOI and need support, please feel free to reach out to us. There are community engaged research seed grants via our partners at the Center for Community Health, There's a primary care practice-based research program, seed grant program, and also the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab has a pilot project program to promote the smart use of technologies to assess real-world outcomes. And that website is like brand new and accepting applications now. And then finally, I want to know our colleague Kelly Scott is here, who's really been leading this behind the scenes. But historically, if you wanted an implementation science consult, you went to this page here on NewCats and requested a consult, and it was buried under, you had to click community engaged resources, and you had to know to do that. I'd like to note that I think by the end of this week, if we click forward, there will be a new link on this page that says request a dissemination and implementation research consultation. If you have a training need, like your group needs a training, if you have a grant writing need, a general training, education and mentorship need, you'd like to write a manuscript, anything is fair game. You can use this form to describe your need, and you will be paired with a methodological expert that will help you through that process. You will most likely meet Miranda or Kelly. So please say hi to Kelly Scott or Miranda Olson. They will likely be on your first points of contact through that form. And so I think now we're going to be sent to our breakout shortly. One of the first things we recommend that groups do is introduce yourself to each other very briefly. Possibly consider locating yourself on the implementation science subway if you like. We're going to ask by the end of our time together today that you sign up for the peer discussant role. Your small group leader will guide you through that process, and we'll share a link in the chat box. And then take your time to discuss the readings, and feel free to let us know either in those small groups, or you can even put in the chat any questions you might have that you want to make sure that we answer for you in this course. I think we're going to be ambitious and go to those groups and then come back here at about 12:55, 56, 57, just to say farewell and remind you what the topic is for next week. So you have about 20 minutes. We said 30 to 35 minutes, and it is 12:34. So I think we did well, Dennis. So congrats for that. And we'll see you all back here in about 20 minutes or so.